The events of this past week have shaken the country, and the reverberations are being felt even here in the Richmond metro area, because every community across the country right now is asking, could that be us? So for that reason, we have convened a rather impromptu roundtable to discuss, as a community, how can we move forward? I'd like to take a moment now to introduce my guests. Let's start with Tiffany Jana, the CEO of TMI Consulting.
Thank you.
Jonathan Zor, you're the president and CEO of the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. And Deputy Chief Stephen Drew with the Richmond Police Department. I want to thank you all for coming in.
Thank you, sir, for having this event. Thank you.
Well, if we had had this conversation 24 hours ago, it would have been a conversation that we sort of knew the rough outlines of. Basically, communities that felt that they were aggrieved and suffering, and policing, the interaction with all the undertones that we're used to in this country that we've heard before of race, poverty, et cetera. Today, it's entirely different with the mass murder in Dallas last night of police officers. So it is safe to say that everywhere, communities are hurting. Obviously, especially the police department everywhere. Our thoughts are, of course, with the Dallas families that have suffered so much in the last 24 hours. So I guess I would like to begin with you, Deputy Chief Drew, and ask, what can you tell the people that you work with, the men and women that work under you? What do you tell them today, going forward, when they go out to work today, when everyone's heart is so heavy?
Well, first, let me say thank you for allowing me to be here and speak with these distinguished individuals and yourself and talk about this. I think it's an important issue. And I was on the phone with Chief Durham well into the night, talking about the events that we were watching unfold right before us on national television. So we were well ahead of getting out messages this morning, trying to remain, putting out as much information as we could. But we know in any investigation, any event like that things unfold. And we probably won't know the full story until late into next week about what actually happened and why it occurred. But what we try to tell our officers is we have set a good tone in Richmond. I think that we're very blessed with the community that we have here, that we prepare for these type of things and we plan for them. I don't know that we can ever prevent them, but I certainly think that we can decrease the possibility of them occurring. We can decrease the number of individuals hurt, and how we train and respond. We have a great relationship with our surrounding jurisdictions, and it's really the same message. Richmond officers, Hanover, Chesterfield, Henrico, the same message. Be vigilant, because we are in Richmond, but we saw what happened in Dallas. We look at what happens throughout the country in different events, even overseas. We look at responses, but we plan and plan and plan, train for those type of events all the time. But what we want to get out to our officers is stay vigilant, stay aware. We're going to work with our state police partners and our fusion centers, Homeland Security, FBI, of any information that are coming forward. We want to put out to them that we have no credible threats to the city of Richmond or the Richmond metro area, but just stay vigilant. If you see something or you feel uncomfortable, call for a backup. The same thing with our Department of Communications is calls come in, and they have, that we're all in support. We're all one team, we're all one family. Remember the citizens here that we serve, and because we saw one incident, it doesn't mean that we have a negative outlook on our whole community. We have a very strong community in Richmond, and I think that's attributed to our crime reductions in the protests that we've had and the events that we've had that we seem to get through fairly well here in the city.
And Tiffany Jana, when you think about the events of this past week and you work with companies, corporations, communities, what is going through your mind in terms of how do we make sense of this, or even better, where do we go from here?
So I think that as a member of the African American community in particular, the whole situation is something that has been on our hearts and in our minds since slavery, frankly. It's nothing is really new. What has changed is that we all have supercomputers in our pockets, and this sort of type of behavior and the bias that exists against all kinds of people is front and center. We're all able to see it. So in terms of what we're able to do about it, we need to do things like this. We need to be able to have conversations with each other, because we are consumed with messages about the other and how people are scary and what is threatening and what is not. So the best thing that we can do is really pay attention and acknowledge that these things are happening. There are too many people who, until recently, believed that these things were not happening, that there really was not, there were not disparities, and that there were not folks who had both power and bias and the ability to influence outcomes in a very negative way. So I'm very impressed when I see police departments that go the extra mile to make sure that their officers are well trained and have the opportunity to understand what their implicit biases can be and how to de-escalate and how to move forward in ways that are very conscientious. But it's work that all of us as individuals have to do. We have to acknowledge, how do we really feel about people across difference, and really sort of take that in and become, build relationships across those differences.
And do you feel like it boils down to sort of sensitivity training, whether you're in a corporation, whether a police department, in a school, in your neighborhood? What do you do to ensure that some of those barriers are broken down, or at least the understanding, a bridge is created?
So I was having a conversation just earlier with Jonathan, and basically our communities in the United States are more segregated now than they were in the height of segregation. We are living in isolated communities, we're worshiping in isolated churches, our schools are very segregated, so we're not creating opportunities to get to know each other. So it's important that we look for opportunities to get to know people from different cultures, from different backgrounds, and really embrace that, because we're really, at the end of the day, not all that different. So if you happen to be in an organization and have access to that kind of training, great, but the average person is not going to be able to make that happen. So the opportunity to build relationships with folks and put yourself in a situation where you are not the majority. Put yourself in situations where you're out in the community. Richmond is a very diverse community. I always say that the best example of inclusion done well here is our festivals. If you go to any one of our festivals, everyone is there. Every color, every race, every creed, socioeconomic class, we're all represented. So take those opportunities to just get to know people in a very real way, and you'll find that we're not that different, and the differences that we do have are beautiful.
Well, and to that end, Jonathan, it sounds like the work you do at the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, you told me an 81-year-old nonprofit.
Yes.
It sounds like when you go out to a school, you can really make that difference and educate both teacher and pupil.
Certainly. I think what we find in situations like this is that when we're trying to react to the situation, it's already too late. And so we need to work with young people and get them from the start to build positive impressions of other people. Law enforcement professionals need not fear every black male that they see on the streets. And people of color need not fear every law enforcement professional they see on the streets. And so that doesn't happen overnight. That comes through sustained relationships, that comes through training, that comes through the building of empathy, that comes through understanding how different groups experience society. And a lot of this ultimately comes down to fear of the unknown, fear of situations. All of that can be addressed through education, through relationship, and through empathy.
Well, and you actually mentioned a class where a child was upset at seeing a police officer because he hadn't had a positive interaction before.
Yeah, a few months ago we were working with a school where there was a second grade class that had a police officer come in to read a book to the class, seemingly an innocuous event, and a black male student in the class, second grader, started crying when he saw the law enforcement professional, because every impression that he had up until that point, everything he'd been taught and everything he'd seen, had been to fear the police. And so if from that young age that was the impression he had, imagine as that person gets older and older, every time he sees a police officer, how he might react. And then imagine how a police officer might react seeing that child maybe acting a little bit defensive, being a little bit negative. And so we need to really work at that level to break down those stereotypes and those negative impressions so that folks can have those relationships and we're not in crises like we've had this week.
Well, and Deputy Chief Drew, it seems like the RPD has been pretty proactive in going out to the community. I know we cover, if not weekly, monthly, the walks, Chief Durham and other officers walking through various communities, making sure that the community knows that the police are there and knows the officers who might be coming through their neighborhoods.
Well, I think Tiffany and John have nailed it. I think at the end of the day, it is a diverse community. So our police department needs to be reflective of the community we serve. So we start there with the individuals we recruit. It's very important that we have a diverse academy, different backgrounds, even ages and race. If you look at our last graduates and the class that's in now, it's a very diverse class. They bring a lot of different backgrounds and they learn from each other. It's the same thing within the department. Chief Durham is very big on transparency, and we try to expose as much of ourselves to the community. How when we have a police-involved shooting, that he's in front of the camera right away. This is what we have at this point, but let the investigation unfold. So we try to share as much. We do that through our Citizens Academy, our Latino Academy, our Youth Academy, where we teach with high school kids. We have our young adult police commissioners, 2 high school students from each high school in the area that come in twice a month and work with us, and we use them and learn from them as much as they learn from us. At the end of the day, it's really You know, it's like Tiffany said, it's a diverse culture, a diverse organization, and we have to work together. I think that has allowed some of the things. We've certainly had our fair share of shootings in the city of Richmond. I think that has allowed the 40-some protests that we had this year, or last year, the protests that went on just last night of the demonstration, that we haven't seen those events. We haven't been on the front page of a newspaper or that unrest in the city of Richmond, because we go up before that protest or that demonstration starts, we shake hands, we have a conversation. What are your intentions? What is your route? We'll block traffic for you, but here's certain guidelines. And most of the time, things work well. And I think when you have those conversations, when you're transparent, when you do the amount of outreach, whether we're badges for baseball, working with inner city kids just on a ball field and exposing them to law enforcement, officers coming out of their pockets and sponsoring kids to go to PAL camps, some that can't afford it. I think all those things, we bond it with elementary kids, middle school, and officers in our high schools. I think that's huge. But we can't sit back and rest. We always have to look for new ways. We just met earlier. Chief Durham wants to have some conversations with the community. So we're looking at with some of our officials and others to facilitate that, to have those ongoing conversations. And Tiffany nailed it. It's very important that we as law enforcement listen to what the community is saying and hear their concerns. We have a simulator in our academy that we allow citizens to go through and see what it's like to make those split-second decisions. And all the training in the world, we're not trying to make police officers out of everyone, but to just understand that some of those things happen that quick. But it's all about transparency, having open conversations, understanding, and being respectful to each other.
And Tiffany, how important is it that if we talk about diversity, that the police department should represent the community that it protects?
It's absolutely critical. It is absolutely critical. That is, the police force represents an organized body that's here to keep us safe, and they have the means to make us feel afraid in certain circumstances, and it just builds a level of trust. Just like there are African Americans who are afraid, there are white people who are afraid, there are people who are committing crimes, and there are folks who aren't. In all of these things that happen, even in these, in some of these awful shootings, I can't say with any degree of confidence that the white police officers, were absolutely out to get these folks. They were in the line of duty, and in many cases probably very afraid and acting on those sudden instincts. When we have folks who represent those communities, it takes down one more barrier, and it makes people feel like there's a likelihood that they share our particular suffering. And we spoke earlier, and we talked about like, as an African American woman, I don't get to disassociate myself from the emotional, the emotional pain that my people are feeling, as it were. So this idea that that anyone would be excluded from, sort of from the conversation, from the emotion, it can't happen. So it really is important that we have folks that look like us, so that we can feel just a little bit safer.
And Jonathan, I want to give you the last word. As we go forward, how critical is education, particularly, say, in the school environment, going to be going forward to if not ratchet down the tension, at least, grow a little more respect for each other?
I think that education is key. I think that there's a process that we can go through where when we start to learn about one another and build relationships, that allows us to build empathy, and that moves us towards a sense of justice and fairness in society. So people need to get beyond the 140 character impression they have of another group. These are not short issues, these are big issues, and they come from hundreds of years of history in our country. We're dealing with a residue of laws, policies, practices, and experiences. And so education becomes key and relationships become key if we want to move towards equity and justice.
Let me just add on to that. You nailed it with education. It's the way we train our officers, not just the new recruits that come on, but the officers that are here, and we go through in-service, and we've all had the implicit bias training. And I think it not just officers teaching other officers, bringing in experts that can talk about real life experiences and real educators that are in an academic world to talk to those recruits. Chief Durham is very, very big on our training of officers that are already here and new recruits coming in. So education, I think, is always a plus in any aspect we can do.
Well, I regret that that's all the time we're going to have today, because obviously we could talk for hours, and we should talk for hours, and we will at another time. I want to thank you all for your frank, honest discussion. Tiffany, Jana, appreciate you coming in today. Jonathan Zor and Stephen Drew, thanks so much to you all for coming in.